Hello, everyone. We're here today talking aesthetics, also known as non-surgical cosmetic procedures. You may have seen in the media or on our socials, there's been much conversation in the news lately about laws to better regulate aesthetic procedures. And that's exactly what we're here to talk about today. So what we know, but also as importantly, what we don't yet know, and really just talk that through with the people that I have in the room today. So whether you're a practitioner or a consumer, someone that's considering having an aesthetic procedure or has done for many years, stay tuned, please, because this is going to be really useful to you. So to give us all the information that we need, I'm joined by some of the biggest brains on this topic, and I can start with no introduction needed perhaps, but with David Sines, CBE. David's got years of experience in advising government on standards around public health and patient safety. He's now the independent chair of the Joint Centre for Cosmetic Practitioners and continues in this role to promote patient safety in non-surgical aesthetics. So hello, David.
Hi, everybody.
I've also got Tamara Sandul. She's here from the Chartered Institute of Environmental Health. The CIH are instrumental really because they represent environmental health officers throughout the country who you may know, and they are responsible for enforcing any local authority licensing that's introduced. Tamara herself has also been a key player in working with politicians in Westminster on this issue particularly. So welcome, Tamara.
Thank you.
We've also got Leslie Blair, MBE. Leslie's CEO of the British Association of Beauty Therapy and Cosmetology. You probably know them as BABTAC, and CIBTAC, the Confederation of International Beauty Therapy and Cosmetology. And BABTAC and CIBTAC represent beauty and aesthetic therapists, championing the importance of recognised qualifications and insurance to ensure that client safety there. Hello, Diane. Leslie.
Hi.
And lastly, we've got Diane. Diane Hay has dedicated most of her professional life to both teaching beauty and aesthetics qualifications, but also writing the training and qualification standards themselves. She also chairs a cross-industry group of beauty organisations that Leslie and myself sit on, who work together to ensure the sector is fairly represented in any changes in regulation. And I should probably actually introduce myself. Hello, everybody. So I'm Victoria Brownlee. I'm here on behalf of the British Beauty Council. We've been working with government, Tamara at CIH, David and JCCP, as well as, of course, Leslie and Diane within the cross-industry group as part of our council's commitment to raising the reputation of the beauty industry. And in terms of that reputation, it's really important to us that setting a level playing field for anyone wanting to offer aesthetic procedures is important for not only the practitioners themselves to ensure that everyone's operating at the same standard, but also in terms of better protecting the public from harm. So that's really where we're coming at it from the British Beauty Council's perspective. But enough talking from me now. I think we should hear from all of our guests. So let's get going, shall we? Let's start with you, Leslie. So these questions are ones that we've all fielded amongst our organisations from people since we've heard about these new regulations coming in. So let's start with what we do know. Are the public now safe when it comes to botched procedures?
Well, unfortunately, not at the moment. The law passed in April 2022 simply gives the UK government powers to introduce a licensing scheme to regulate premises and practitioners who offer certain procedures. The details relating to this new licensing scheme, unfortunately, have not been written or passed yet. So sorry for your first question. I can't give you a definitive answer, but obviously, as soon as we know, we will make that widely available.
Absolutely, and it's important to say that where it's not safe and fine yet, we should really be making that clear. So thanks, Leslie.
Yeah, no problem.
David, the brains. When will the new law come in regulating aesthetic procedures, and what will be considered an aesthetic procedure under the law?
So really important, and this is where we start the conversation, building on Leslie's very helpful introductory comments. I think the first thing to say, which is so important, is that nobody is trying to restrict safe practice on the high street, in our salons, our spas, our clinics, but we are paramount in our intention to work with government, and indeed the government itself is intent on protecting the public by introducing a new license. The timeline, the when, certainly is not defined yet specifically, but we know from conversations with ministers, and yes, we do mean ministers, that they are intent on putting this licence in place. Now, in the absence of a definite timeline, we do know, though, there will be 2 national consultation exercises. One will be to define the procedures that will be in the scope of the licence. I will come back to that in a moment. And the second will be what standards will need to be put in place with regard to education and training for those procedures that are in scope of the licence. And of course, we have to define together with government leading what the actual scheme of licensing will look like. So our understanding is in the late autumn of this year, consultation will commence with regard to the procedures to be included. Our guess, and it's a pretty good guess, I think, we're looking at about 2 years' time for the full implementation of that particular licence, which will also have at that same time confirmation of that regulatory approach, who's going to oversee the licence, endorse it, and also what those education and training standards will be.
Thanks, David. That's really comprehensive. And you brought Diane in there really nicely. Diane as our our LED laser, etc. expert. Why don't you talk more widely for practitioners in particular? So what we see is going to change in terms of what they can and can't do.
Thank you, Victoria, and Leslie and David for that really informative introduction as to where we're currently sat in regards to the licensing piece, and tomorrow obviously for the help that CIH have supported with. And just to really reiterate what colleagues have said, is that we really need to wait at this moment in time for the drafting of the new licence to learn exactly what is going to be included within it and what the level of training will look like for each of the relevant modalities that have been mentioned within the clause. But what we do know is that from the date that's yet to be agreed is that practitioners who perform procedures within the scope of the new licence will have to demonstrate that they do possess a nationally determined standard of knowledge and skill and proficiency to perform those procedures safely and effectively. And again, as David's mentioned, that is irrespective of background, where people are coming from. This applies to every practitioner to make sure that they are fully fledged and proficient in the modality under which they are going to deliver to the public within the confines of the new licence. Practitioners will be required to work from premises that also meet a national standard in health protection and infection control, and this will be determined by the local authority environmental health practitioners. So obviously CIH have a big role to play within that to make sure that that will be enforceable. And I think that's one of the key changes for practitioners at this moment in time and the public, is that we will have something, whilst we're not sure exactly what it's going to look like, it will absolutely be enforceable for the first time across the piece for every practitioner involved. Other standards that are also expected to be included to protect the public in the licence will be issues around product supply, storage of products and medicines, prescribing practice, complaints procedures, insurance as a mandated aspect, again, for all practitioners, and the information that is given to practitioners is appropriate and authorised and in line with the Advertising Standards Authority piece as well. So there's a real collective approach of standardisation for standards across a number of areas that all pull to the thread of public safety.
Yeah, that's really well put, Diane. And I think it sort of really hits home that point that we really just want people all working to a similar high standard. And this is really what that's there to ensure, because really that can help safeguard the public.
Absolutely.
But you mentioned CIH really, really well there and the important role that they've got to play tomorrow. So I should probably bring you in there. Talking to us from a licensing point of view then, what would you say we can expect from the new license when it comes in? So I'm thinking about how practitioners might get a license, what the cost will be, will a premises have to be inspected in order to obtain or renew a license, those kind of things. Could you talk us through that particular area?
Yes, absolutely. But as others have said, there's not much that we know for certain at this point, but there are a few things that we can glean from the wording of the Health and Care Act, and indeed from other licensing regimes and how they've been designed in the past. However, all the detail will come in the regulations, and we should get a sense of direction from government when the consultation lands, hopefully later this year. The new licensing regime will be enforced by local authorities and is likely to be regulated by environmental health and licensing officers, as are some other procedures at the moment. There'll be a practitioner and a premises license, and there'll be requirements to be met to obtain the license, as others have already mentioned. The costs of the license are likely to be periodic. In other areas of licensing, a license is granted for about 3 to 5 years. Okay. And I'm sure government wouldn't want to unnecessarily burden businesses who are compliant. So I think that time frame sounds about right. There certainly won't be an annual license that would be too burdensome for the regulator, and it would be too much for the practitioners and the businesses out there. But it will need to be time limited to ensure that there's a re-inspection element, as the regulators are kind of going back in, re-inspecting from time to time to make sure that everything is still fine and safe for the public. In some licensing arrangements, there's also kind of a risk rating element. So sometimes a license might be granted for a shorter period of time if there's if a practitioner is seen to be kind of not quite compliant and the regulator feels they need to go back in. I'm not sure if it will be the case here, but it has happened in other licensing regimes. This might be more straightforward. It's also normal for the business applying for the license to pay for the cost of regulation, that kind of is mirrored against in other licensing regimes. So the license fee is likely to include the cost of the inspection and any admin work to check over the documents and the requirements. However, we don't know whether the license fee will be set nationally yet, or whether it will be set by each local authority. That is not defined in the in the legislation at the moment. Okay. We would probably prefer a national fee because it would give that level playing field and clarity for businesses, but it does need to cover the cost of regulation everywhere. But in terms of whether your premises kind of will be inspected before you obtain a license, again, the Health and Care Act is quite vague in this respect. It says the regulations may require local authorities not to grant a premises license unless the premises has been inspected. So the word may there is key. I expect that there will need to be an inspection because of the nature of these procedures and what the licensing regime is aiming to do. But again, in other licensing regimes, such as licensing of the private rented sector, which is some small areas of the sector where they've been licensed, sometimes the inspections take place during the course of the license, so in those 3 to 5 years. So that is also possible. Also because there's a limited number of regulators out there. So we just don't know at this stage what government will decide to do. But as with all new regulations, there's likely to be a grace or a transition period to give everyone enough time to kind of apply and obtain a license before it's illegal to trade without one. So as you can imagine, there'll be a big backlog, there'll be lots of practitioners, and I imagine government will make provision to give everyone the time to apply and make sure they meet the requirements.
That's really actually such a good point. That transition period is something that we should probably really stress in this session, just because of the kind of panicked messages that a lot of us have been getting about what's coming in, what training do I need to do, what do I need to change in regards to my premises for inspection. That we are in a really good place, that we are on a road where we are likely to see this going through for a number of years, and then, like you say, there will be that transition period. So it's a case of there's no fire at the moment, don't panic, as it were. But it was interesting you mentioned about other kinds of license, because that's another question that we've had quite a lot of questioning from. It's around, and David, perhaps you can come in there, people that are already licensed through something maybe like a special treatments license, or they're CQC regulated. Is it a case that they're already covered under those regulatory schemes, licensing schemes, or is the intention that they will also have to obtain this license?
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. And I really like the introduction of the concept of transitioning. So I think, again, let's reinforce that message for each and every one of us. So no one would expect things to change overnight. So even when that license appears in approximately 2 years' time, you're not going to have all whistles and all bells actually there in place. There will be a period of transition, possibly up to another 2 years, who knows, for qualifications to actually be met. But certainly, we're all being sensible about this. It's a longer term journey, but we need to be on the journey. That's the critical thing. So to answer this specific question, any person who's currently regulated, whether it be by a professional regulator, a doctor, a nurse, for example, with a GMC or NMC, whether their clinics or their premises are registered with the Care Quality Commission, the CQC, they will still need to comply with the actual regulatory requirements of the new license once it's defined. Now, at the moment, and I don't see why it would be any different to this, the new license will be enforced, as Tamara has indicated, by local government, by our environmental health team. So that will mean that colleagues who are registered within the CQC itself, they would need to have a further license, or, and here we go to the conversation, or there would need to be an articulation or an agreement between the Care Quality Commission and local licensing authorities to accept that the new standards could be inspected and regulated as part of an enhanced scheme of inspection undertaken by the CQC in partnership with, alongside, or in some form of cooperative approach with the local government. So let me answer that question slightly differently and to say, yes, everyone will need to meet the new standard irrespective of whom they're currently registered with, but government will almost definitely want to remove duplication or a requirement for individuals to have to go through more than one licensing scheme if they possibly can. But there are lots of conversations, Victoria, to be had here on who does what, how it will be done. But certainly the mood music suggests that people are listening to see ways of collaborating to form an enhanced scheme of regulation, whether it be CQC. But finally, remember this, the actual procedures that are in the scope of the license now, sorry, potentially in the scope of the license now, only one of them is actually CQC regulated at the moment, and that is hair restoration surgery.
Right.
So in other words, there are real issues about the procedures themselves, whether they would be regulated by the CQC, but even if they're not, that doesn't matter. There can be ways of collaborating and joining up the actual inspection scheme.
Yeah, as Tamara said before, concerns regarding resource and actually having enough people on the ground to be policing this will be key to anything that the government chooses to bring in. So that will always be a key consideration. I'm just thinking something we haven't really touched on a great deal, but we know is within the wording of what has been announced through the Health and Care Act, is around insurance. So Leslie, your specialist subject here. What can you tell us about the insurance side of things? Do we know, will insurance be mandatory to those offering these kinds of aesthetic treatments or not?
Yeah, so what we do know is that the actual level of insurance has still to be decided. Mm-hmm. But what we do know is that the insurance will be mandatory for procedures covered in the scope of the licence. So that is really, really good news. So really all practitioners will be legally required to hold indemnity insurance, obviously to protect members of the public if something goes wrong with the procedures. That is definitely good news that it is going to be becoming mandatory for the modalities that are covered in the scope of the licence.
Great. So it goes back to that, what we know and we don't know yet. We know that there will be some kind of insurance. The level and degree to which is still where there's conversations to be had. Yeah,
it's a great step forward that we're going to have it, that has got to be mandatory, because that is just increasing public protection as well.
Yeah. So in terms of detail then, Diane, perhaps you could talk a bit about what qualifications aesthetic practitioners are going to have to offer the kinds of procedures that will be in the scope of the licence. Or again, is that just something we just don't know yet?
At this stage, as we've kind of all alluded to, we obviously have the green light in regards to the government's intention to create a licence, which is fantastic news for the aesthetic sector and also for public safety. Obviously, the future of this licence is currently enforceable in England only, and as we've all said, you know, there is a varying degree at this moment in time of practitioner offer, premises, insurance, and that's what's led to the licensing scheme in the first place, and a concern that there was such a variety of training and qualification structures, some deemed better than others, and again, I'm not going to comment on that on a webinar. What we do know is that the exact level and content of the national, as we see it, mandated standard is still yet to be determined. All the people sat around the table are involved in that conversation. All practitioners will have input because of the consultation piece. The intention being, as we understand it from the licensing, that only practitioners who actually meet and prove competence and capability and proficiency in whichever modality it is that they're going to perform will be able to carry out those procedures that are going to be defined within the scope of the new license. So we can't exactly say exactly what will and will not be included regarding qualifications, but what we do know is there is an intention for one mandated national covering England standard that will be required to be met by all practitioners. And as we said, that will be determined following the consultation between government and industry, and it will go to public consultation, so the public will have a view too.
Thanks, Diane. So once that's determined, Tamara, maybe you can talk from the enforcement perspective there. Is it the case that you as someone as a practitioner could be banned from being able to offer these kinds of procedures if they can't demonstrate that they show that they have competency in those particular areas, so they don't have the correct qualifications or training that when you go and do those inspections? Oh, you're on mute. Had to happen once.
Yes, I've got builders next door, so I'm muting myself. But yes, I think that's the intention from the government, is really to make regulations that would prohibit an individual from carrying out specified cosmetic procedures unless they hold a license, and prohibit a person from using a premises unless that premises has been licensed. And that's very much in the legislation at the moment. But the way that kind of we would expect this new licensing regime to work is really to have, you know, one national list or online register where everyone can check whether a particular practitioner is licensed and what they're licensed to do, so that there's that clarity. And of course, there'll be lots of awareness raising activity that will be needed to kind of to make sure the public are aware of this, where they need to go to make those checks. However, if someone were to operate without a license, it looks like the regulations would create sort of offences, and the non-compliance of this would be a financial penalty. So that's the way it looks at the moment. We don't know the amounts of the penalty or the limits, but clearly these penalties need to be high enough to be a deterrent to someone, you know, trying to practice without a license, to create that level playing field for people who did invest in the correct qualifications and the correct requirements. But even at the moment, local authorities do have some other powers that they can use if they feel that there's a real risk or danger to public health, and they will use the other powers under Health and Safety at Work Act to prosecute an individual who continuously kind of evades and tries to practice without a license, and that will go through the courts and result in a criminal conviction. So that's the other kind of hard route, very rare probably, but that's kind of the stop point to stop someone continuously kind of evading this new regime.
Thanks, Tamara. So this is going to be a really big change for people. In terms of why we sort of as a collective think that it's such an important step for the future of aesthetics, I think, Tamara, what you mentioned there about almost that sense of transparency, of being able to see quite clearly who has what level of qualification, who's actually got that competency to be able to perform different treatments, and having that in a much more public forum, I think from the British Beauty Council's perspective is only a positive. And I think for years we've had an issue around the aesthetics sector in particular, where it's really very difficult to sort of find your way through to know what is actually reputable and what is not reputable when you're looking for these kinds of treatments. And unfortunately, the way that almost society has been is that sometimes these treatments are a little bit secretive, a bit cloak and dagger. We don't want to be open about the fact that we might be going to have fillers or Botox treatments, etc. So I really love this idea of transparency that's going to come as a result of this regulation. Leslie, why do you think it's such an important step from Babtac's perspective that we're doing this work here?
I think that always I'm looking to raise the standards within the industry, to promote professionalism in our industry. But obviously the first, the most important point is consumer and public safety. Mm-hmm. So I think for us all working in the background doing this, and we can ensure that that's what we're going to achieve. Because I think anyone who knows me, my biggest bugbear is the short courses, and people can go out and do these things. And yeah, people kind of fall asleep when I start talking about insurance and all of these things. But it's just so important. But I think first and foremost from Babtac, you know, we're a membership organisation. We are trying to promote professionalism within the industry, and that the correct people are doing the correct things. Mm-hmm. So I think, you know, that's really, really important. But I think safety, professionalism, yeah. So yeah, that's why we're here doing it.
Yeah, it's good.
And I love our industry. I think that's probably the most important thing.
David, like this, I feel this is a part of your life's work that maybe you can relax after this finally comes in, or perhaps you'll go on to your next mission. But I guess from either a personal perspective, or in terms of your previous work and coming to this point, or from a JCCP perspective, why is it for you such an important step?
Yeah, thank you. And I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, the JCCP was formed for one purpose, and that was to see the implementation of a national system of regulation and oversight for non-surgical cosmetic practice.
So box ticked.
Yeah, exactly. We got a tick. So this is now a major phase of pre-implementation. So of course, our job isn't complete until we've seen the standards in place and that they're universally applied. But to be quite frank, our job is done once regulation's in place. Mm-hmm. Whether or not others manage registers, because after all, it's all very well having a system in place, but as well, Tamara knows, regulation doesn't always take us to where we want to be, where it comes to the public protection. It's about the implementation, the oversight, and the day-to-day maintenance of those standards. So registers of the qualifications that will be in place, mm-hmm. or need to be in place, the education and training providers, and of the practitioners. So there's still a lot more to do. And you heard in Diane's very helpful expose, we've still more work to do on advertising standards, social media, the supply of safe products, dermal fillers becoming prescription-only devices, and a lot of work on prescribing practice. Then the premises. So there's still a lot to do. So more than phase one complete, but this will bring a very important contribution to public protection, and as you've heard from my colleagues, through standardization. So it's all about the consumer voice. But here's a big message for every one of us. How do we now encourage members of the public to actually take assurance that these new proposals will in fact seek to protect them without adding cost necessarily to the actual product and the supply of those products and services on the high street? So consumerism, the promotion of public websites, social media, and really encouraging members of the public to seek safe practice can only be good for the industry or the sector as much as for the individual. So yes, more work to do, but a great mission, I think, for all of us collectively to have worked with government to have achieved this particular pivotal place in time.
Thanks, David. And Tamara, I think from your perspective, some might question, why would you want to, why have you been so keen to work with people in Westminster on this specific issue, when ultimately it's going to create more work for the environmental health officers you represent, who, as we know, are already massively overstretched, hugely under-resourced, and do a fantastic job? Why has it been such a key priority for CIEH?
Well, I mean, it's really been an issue for our members because they go out there and they come across procedures being performed really badly, being performed by practitioners who don't have enough training and infection control and the procedure itself. So I think over many years, that picture of, you know, a mixed environment in which contributes to poor, you know, public health and poor public safety has really led us to campaign on this issue, despite the fact that, as you say, you know, that there are already issues with resources. Local authorities don't often have enough of them, but I think in terms of your question about why, you know, what kind of differences this is going to have and why it's such an important step, I think your point about the transparency is probably the key one that the public will see from there. And I think that central hub where we'll have a register of practitioners who are licensed is really key, because it will also be the place where the public can find reliable information about risk, that they can get it from an independent source, and also a place where they might be able to submit a complaint about a practitioner and ensure that that complaint goes straight to the regulator. Because at the moment, what happens is those complaints get dispersed, the public doesn't know who to complain to, and local authorities often just don't hear about it. So I'm hoping that the new system, through this increased transparency, will have that feedback loop, which will allow regulators to really, you know, be much more on the ball about where they need to inspect and who they need to check out.
Thanks, Tamara. And I think lastly, Diane, maybe if we can come to you. Obviously, this has been part of your life's work as well. This is your thing. You are all about maintaining and creating those minimum standards and training standards. So a bit about the importance of it to you, but also where we are now. So we're in this interim period that the new legislation, new licensing isn't in yet. So from a consumer point of view, from somebody's point of view that's wanting to have these kinds of procedures, what advice would you give to somebody looking to have those done right now in order to sort of keep them safe in what they're doing?
Well, that's a huge question, and similarly to my colleague,
you've got 40 seconds.
Yeah, I've got 40 seconds. And yeah, I mean, as we've already said, you know, reiterate everything that everybody here has said. So I'm not going to try and not duplicate where possible, but inherently will do. Yes, standards has been a huge and still is a huge part of my involvement, as you said, for a very long time. And I think what's important is that it's this minimum level of standard. We know there is a huge variability in what people perceive to be a standard. Mm-hmm. And that's why we need this national benchmark. There are standards there, but it's bringing all of that work together, both with the JCCP and the National Occupational Standards, which are aligned, but it's actually saying, no, there is a standard that protects both consumer and also business owners, but also practitioners who want to do it right. You know, when it is a minefield, when you look at what you can go and be trained in, and the next new modality, orphan treatments coming through, and, you know, we can do serious damage to people, both physically, but also emotionally, within regards to these procedures and what that then can impact on people's well-being and life. So practitioners quite often want to do the right thing. So having a national standard and having a national minimum mandated standard that's enforceable and licensable means that they know that when they go and do a program and they go and do a course, it is actually verified and appropriate to allow them to reach the proficiency and competency for what they want to do. And what it does do is it will iron out those people who are doing things correctly and those people who are trying to make a very fast way into the sector without having the years of experience it takes people to actually reach this level of modality through a applied pathway of stepping stones from one level to another to another to another to get to that expertise. So I think that's really important for the consumer. And in regards to what do they look for, you know, we need them to be very open and asking questions. Any practitioner who holds a full, proper regulated qualification, has insurance, is set up properly, will not mind. Yeah, with a member of a trade organisation on a current register with an association that has appropriate codes of conduct, then no practitioner will ever mind giving that information to a member of the public, because we want them to be secure that they are in safe hands.
It's almost a badge of honor, isn't it? It's something to be proud of, and these practitioners do want to shout about it.
Absolutely, and lots of practitioners are welcoming the licensing scheme, because it means that they can have that, exactly that quality stamp to say, we meet this national standard, we care about your safety, we are passionate about what we do, and we want to help people and not damage people emotionally, physically, or otherwise. So for me, yes, exactly. Standards, everything's about standards. It's where it starts, it's where it stops. And ultimately, it gives the industry the professional reputation it deserves, rather than an awful lot of what we've got at the moment, which is just a sort of a minefield of where do I go and how do I know I'm safe? And every individual deserves to know that they're going to a verified individual who has their safety right at the centre of what they are doing.
Absolutely. Thank you, Diana. That's actually a really good point to leave on. I think there's been so much information for us to digest here, so I'm going to draw it to a close today, but I should say that all of our respective organisations are available if people have any kind of questions or want to give any feedback on particular areas of concern or things that they still want clarification on. Please do contact JCCP, CIEH, Diane. I'll put your contact details on here as well when we put this out, and Leslie, obviously, with BABTAC, similarly with British Beauty Council. Also, do please keep checking our websites. We'll be each of us putting all of the updates that are coming in around the development of the licensing scheme as we progress through these next couple of years, including any information about upcoming consultations, the two that David mentioned at the beginning. But really, I should just say thank you guys for your incredible insight. You are, as I said, the brains of the operations here. So really, really thank you. And thanks to everyone for watching.
Thank
Bye,
you,
everyone.
Victoria.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.